I want to welcome those who are joining us on Zoom, and of course those who are here in our congregation. We're going to hear from Dr. Robert Perez on the Exodus 14, the miracle of the sea. Bob Perez.
The miracle of the sea. It's the miracle on the sea or of the sea, but it's a great story. It's the famous crossing of the Red Sea. You've seen that movie, The Ten Commandments. So I'd like to start it with something that popped in my mind as I was thinking about this last night. Think of God's creation, or nature. And I was looking this up last night. Do you realize that 3 of the top 4 causes of death in the great outdoors include, surprisingly, it's not a bear, it's not animals, it's not diseases. The second cause of death is falling. People go in the outdoors, you're walking on a trail, and you fall to your death. That happens. I remember when I was in high school, one of my high school baseball players went out in the mountains and fell off a cliff and died right there in the arms of his fellow friend, Sergio Martinez. I never forgot that. Number 3 is vehicle accidents. People not paying attention, especially now. We have cell phones, different things. You're driving on Mountains Road. You hit a side of the road and things fall. So that's another cause of death. Number 3, this is in national parks. Number 4, for lack of a better term, lack of common sense. Idiocy. People make dumb things. When one man fell off the Grand Canyon when he was showing off to his little daughter, I read this morning. He went off the cliff, or jumped over the little gate, acting like he was going to fall over the cliff, playing around because he saw a little ledge there that he was going to jump and scare his daughter. So he jumped down, lost his balance, rolled over, and rolled off a 400-foot cliff. People do dumb things. But I did this for a reason. Why did I bring that up? Does anyone want to guess the number 1 cause of death in the great outdoors? Drowning. By far. By far, above all the other ones, was drowning. And today's story is no exception. And it makes me, as I said that, I just got a sense of feeling, I guess, sad. The Egyptians, 600 of them die. And it's interesting the way God, through Moses, writes about this story. Here's what he says about this topic. And I'm just going to read it. Today's story is no exception. God reveals his glory. That's how he writes it. He reveals his glory through a mighty act of creation, the parting of the Red Sea, through the great equalizer, death. That's how God's glory is revealed. And the question that I want to raise to you is why? This is why this text, or these stories of the Exodus, of God as the divine warrior, is not received well with people in the world that don't understand why would God do this. So hopefully today's sermon will answer that question. As God's glory is revealed through creation and through the death of not the firstborn, but of the best charioteers, the best of the army of Egypt, why would that happen? Well, that's what today's sermon is all about. So let's go to Exodus 14. And I'm just going to pick up right from verse 1. And I'm probably going to do a little bullet point form of the first 18 verses, because those set up really verse 19. When he parts the sea. Moses does. You've seen the movie with Charlton Heston. Okay? So let's pick up in verse 2. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, and then he gives him an imperative, a command. Tell the Israelites to turn back. And he tells them as they're going to the sea, instead of going around, he says, tell them to turn back. That is completely a bad military move. And what it's showing is military strategy going on from Pharaoh's point of view and from God's point of view. So look at what the next verse says. Pharaoh will think, and he's a military buff here. What will he think? He says, Pharaoh would think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. He's thinking as a military strategist. That's a dumb move, he's saying. Why would they trap themselves by the sea? So he's thinking that, and he goes, okay. And then this is where God steps in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. A term mentioned 3 times in this chapter. Beware of hardening your heart against God. I guess as a little side note, that's not my main lesson, but beware of that. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. So God's strategizing, as Pharaoh's thinking one way, that's a bad move militarily for the Israelites. God is thinking another way. I will harden his heart, and they will pursue him. But look what he says. This is the key of why I talked about creation. But I will gain glory for myself. What does he mean by that? I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So do you realize, I know I'm not going to go too much on this, that God had never been really with Israel at this point. Moses had visited him at Mount Sinai, and he appeared to them. He went back into Egypt, Moses, and he talks to Pharaoh. 10 plagues occurred, right? But God's presence is still on Mount Sinai. And in this story, the glory of God, when he visits upon people, it is both glorious and dangerous. When you get in the presence of God, it is dangerous. I've mentioned that before. It's like touching electricity. If you have the right equipment on, you're fine. But if you touch electricity, if your hands are wet, if you lick your hands, or I saw in a dumb commercial where these guys were actually in a jacuzzi with flippers on, drinking beer, and they had a ladder and they were plugging in their little cords into an electricity cord. Water conducts electricity. So basically the point is, we got to be careful of that God is dangerous. His presence is glorious, but yet it's dangerous. Okay? So this is what it's setting up. I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And we know, those of you that know the story, you know what's going to happen to them. But it's just interesting the wording he uses. Keep that point in your mind. So, verse 5, that's kind of the first little scene. What God's strategy is, he's going to harden this guy's heart to lure him into a trap. And the question is why? Is God just? God is a divine warrior. Is this fair that God can do this to people? Verse 5, this is the next scene. If you're in a Hollywood movie, this is the next scene. The king of Egypt was told that the people had fled. Now wait a second. He already had let them go 3 days earlier. What do you mean they were told? So someone came and rubbed it in. Hey, these guys are leaving. And guess what? Then Pharaoh and his leaders, his officials, what did they do? They did what Burt Reynolds did when he was swimming out into the buoy, right? He changed their mind. They changed their hearts. Don't do that. Don't bargain with God is the point. Remember, we mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. What have we done? Verse 6 or verse 5b. We have let the Israelites go and lost their service. So he made his chariot. This is important. This is the only verse that shows that Pharaoh went after them too. And he's never mentioned again, other than in history, that he was part of this chaos. And look what he says. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him, and he took 600. And it's a little interesting note here. He took the best. His best charioteers. What's that?
There's 2 to a chariot, the guy riding and a soldier.
So he took his best. So think of all those men that died that day. So remember that statement in verse 4. I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and his army. He's setting up something that's not real easy to swallow. It's a warning. So look at the bottom of verse 8. They're going after him, Egypt with his officers all over them. And then verse 8, God's action. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Now, it's interesting when I was translating that, who was marching out boldly? Was it Pharaoh's army marching toward them boldly to go after them? Or were the Israelites? It was the Israelites. The sons of Israel were marching out boldly because they were free. They were free from Pharaoh, and this is setting up the tension as what's going to happen next. They're free. They finally escaped this tyrant, this person that was persecuting them for 430 years, and then they turn around and look, and they see the Egyptians coming after them, and that's the next scene. Verses 10 and following. As Pharaoh approached, the Egyptians looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them, and they were terrified. Wouldn't you be? It's easy to say, well, didn't you remember the 10 plagues, what God had just done with all these people? Didn't you see? And they were terrified. And this next little section foreshadows what happened in the wilderness. What do the Israelites do? That's right. They whine. There wasn't enough wine for their complaining and or crackers for all their whining going on, right? That's a bad joke. But anyways, they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, this is verse 11. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So who needs to learn the lesson here? Is it Pharaoh or the Israelites? Look at verse 6, chapter 16. I'm just going to skip ahead. I said this is a foreshadow of things to come. Chapter 16, verse 2. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve his entire assembly to death. So they're still doing that. And this story is repeated in Numbers chapter 20, and this is part of the problem where Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. So this story is big. It's setting up what's going to happen. So the Israelites are complaining, and Moses is part of the complaining too, by the way. We can read verses 13 and 14 that paint Moses in a great light, but I'm going to skip to verse 15, and this is why commentators have a hard time with this. Look what it says in verse 15. Obviously Moses says, hey, don't be afraid. God will take care. Stand firm. Don't worry about it. But look how God answers Moses. A warning to us as leaders, I guess, or the human side of leadership. The Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Why are you complaining? To his leader. And look what he says. He doesn't even listen to him. In a sense, he says, this is another imperative, tell the Israelites to move on. Don't sit where you're doing, don't look back, go forward. And that's what we need to do in church. We need to go forward, amen? Amen. And that's what he's saying, quit looking back, go, move. And this is setting it up, and then look what he says again. Come back to my opening illustration. I prayed that my sermon today would help you see God's glory. And the big act of God's glory is through a great act of creation. And he repeats that again in verse 17 and 18. Look at verse 17 and 18. He repeats that phrase. First, let me go down to 15. Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff. Stretch out your hand over the sea. This is why I brought in the creation. It's a great act of creation that God does this. Just like the story of the flood. Just like the story of God creating the heavens and earth in Genesis chapter 1:9. And it was good. He created the dry land and he said it was good. And when the flood came after 60 days, however long, 150 days, the ground was dry. And Moses and Noah was able to come out. So God is a God of creation. The Green New Deal is on God's terms, not man's terms. And that's not a political statement. I always believe that God's in control of that, and we are not in control of that stuff. Sorry, I get a little tense about that, but I believe God is in control of that. I truly believe that. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. And notice what's happening here. All this stuff, he's telling all these details, and meanwhile the Egyptians are still pursuing them. Did they lose their head? Didn't they know the story? This was 3,500 years ago. They were closer to the story of the flood and all these great, and the 10 plagues, what just happened. Did they forget all that? Do we forget? I will harden, verse 17. The heart, and notice this is the key difference here. The first time he says, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh and his officials. What does he say here? So he can harden the heart of the whole group. I will harden the heart of the Egyptians so that they will go after them. And there he states that phrase again. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and his army. So my question to you is, how is he going to gain glory? You know the answer. It makes me sad. I don't know any Egyptians, but what popped in my mind, and I don't want to say this because I'm going to make me cry, but I was 24, 25 years old at Pepperdine University. And I remember when the president of Egypt got assassinated. And they showed it on TV. This was the first time I seen anything militarily happen. Anwar Sadat. I don't know if you know him, you know how he got assassinated, but he was gunned down with machine guns in an airport in Egypt. I never forgot that. And I just wanted to say that Egyptian people, I wonder when they read this story, how they read this. You know where God's going with this. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and horsemen, the Egyptians, and here's the key, the Egyptians, and you and I will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh and his chariots. And all that sets up the next story. So my 3 points is this. God's glory, or what's at stake here? God's glory, entering God's presence. Remember, this story is about God's power, but now he's going to start being with his people. And if you go into God's presence in an unpurified way, in a wrong state, don't forget what happened to Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10, when God's glory, they offered unauthorized censers to God, and the glory came out and consume them. So, anyways, you got the point. God's glory is dangerous because it reveals that God is a God who is in control of creation and death. And there's no way around it. Maybe to just give you some good news, let's think of Jesus. I mentioned this in Bible class. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled. God's presence dwelt among us. And then the next verse says, we have seen his glory. I wonder where he got that concept from. Probably from right this text. We have seen his glory, the one and only Son. Glory on the cross, what he did, resurrection. We have seen his glory. It's the new Exodus. So anyways, that's the story. So before I preach and give you 2 points, God knew Pharaoh would not listen, yet he gave him many chances. Remember I stated that last week? How many chances? 10 chances. And he even gives them another chance here. He gives them a chance to stop what they're doing, turn around and go back. But they're so caught up in their sin and their pursuit that they forget where they're at. And they forget to read the danger signs. That's why people do dumb things in nature. You forget that you can die from a fall. If you go in water above waterfalls, like what I did when I was young, you can die if you fly over the cliff or if you go over the waterfall. And swim in the slippery apron and the pool right above it. I did it. I thought I was strong enough to swim beyond the current. So I'm still alive today. But anyways, the point is people make mistakes, and the Egyptians were so caught up in what they were doing, they forgot where they were at. Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. And that's part of this text. Don't let your heart be so hardened toward God and his church and his people, or some of the leaders, that you don't listen anymore. God bends Pharaoh's evil to his purposes and lures him into his own destruction. That's a hard concept to swallow. Just like God smoted the firstborn, God's going to smote these Egyptians. And it's to show his glory. It makes no sense to me sometimes, preaching on texts like that. So, back to the text, I want to give you 2 points. God's glory is revealed in 2 ways in this text. Point A would be God's glory is revealed through his creation. So what does he do? Verse 19. Then, notice what happens. This is the first time since Moses was in the burning bush, or not Moses, but God was in the burning bush, and Moses looked to it in chapter 3, verse 6 and 14. An angel appears. Then an angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind. This shows me action. That God is going to now act. And he's using an angel to go behind the army. And when you see the movie The Ten Commandments, that pillar of cloud, on one side it's light to the Israelites. On the other side it's darkness. And he wouldn't allow the Egyptians to pass beyond that cloud or that barrier, that chasm, whatever it was. And they were stuck there all night long. In the meantime, the sea is being parted. In verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea because God told him, and Yahweh turned the sea into dry ground. In an instant, it says there was a strong east wind and all that happened. And before you know it, then the Israelites marched right through it on dry ground. That took faith. Especially if they read this little illustration, this article that I read this morning about the number one cause of death in the great outdoors is what? Drowning. So they must have been scared as they were toiling through these waters that were on the right and the left. But the Egyptians did not get the hint. At this point, if I was an Egyptian and I was in the army, I wouldn't have listened to my commander. I would have said, look, enough's enough. But they were so caught up in their pursuit or whatever they were doing that they could not turn back. They were being lured and the trap was working. Verse 23, then the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians finally get it. But it was too little, too late. Don't do that. Look what they said. Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting them against Egypt. And what popped in my mind is a dumb little scene from the movie Titanic when Cal Hotley was ready to get on the boat to leave Titanic, but I guess Jack and Rose that was his fiancée, were together. And instead of getting on the boat, he was so furious about what he was doing, he went after them as the boat is sinking, forgetting where he was at. And that's kind of like us getting caught up. He gets so caught up and he chases them throughout the boat and trying to shoot him. The boat's sinking and he could have got away. He gets away anyways. And then he realizes, him and his partner realize they're going to die. And one of the windows busts open and his partner dies, and Cal, he realizes he's like in water this deep as the boat's sinking. And that's the situation with the Egyptians. Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting against them, but it's too little, too late. And now the glory of the Lord is going to be revealed through his second mighty act. There's no way around it. God's glory is revealed through the death of the Egyptians. One more time. God's glory is revealed through the death of the Egyptians. Verse 26, Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it. Interesting. Instead of going away from the sea, they were going toward it. So they were so much in confusion, they were going into the middle of the ocean. They shouldn't have been in there in the first place. They should have caught the warnings. And that's my warning to you. Don't get in it in the first place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea, and the water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Now you see why it's hard to preach on this. God is a divine warrior. You don't want to mess with God's power or presence in this story. The Egyptians should have remembered the flood story, I think. Just like we know what happened in the flood story. The plagues, God's miracles that had been occurring leading up to this point. Yet they were so consumed in their pursuing of Israel, or in their pursuing of their own selfish desires, that it hindered their ability to see that God was working. And do we do that? And when they finally realized it, it was too little, too late. That day, verse 30, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And let me read one verse up there. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. That's what made them change. When they saw 600 of the best army men right there before their very eyes, it changed their hearts. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him. And another little tidbit, and in his servant Moses too. Leadership is not easy. Right? We have elders now. We have people that have been leaders in the church for a while. God's representatives. It's really God's glory, but also in his leaders. And you'll see the story of Exodus is really going to begin right now. And the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So here are 2 or 3 takeaways. Obviously, don't be like the Egyptians, too little, too late. Okay? One quick review. God's glory is revealed through creation. Do you believe that? That is the real green new deal. God's in charge of all that. So God's glory is revealed in creation. Number 2. God's glory is revealed through death. And this is where Jesus comes. God's glory is revealed through Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came full of grace and truth. And his name was Jesus. And it's no coinkydink that the book of John, the second half, from the Passion narrative onward, is called the Book of Glory, because it's all about Jesus' death, burial, and his resurrection. May God bless you as we think about our lives. Don't wait till it's too late, too little, too late. All right? God bless you.